Hello and welcome back to another episode of FIXPod, podcast series run by Fix Next Gen Committee to help support younger generation and future leaders in trading as they build their career and navigate a fast-changing industry. I'm Rugi, Senior Business Development Manager at LSEG, looking after relationships with trading firms on LSE and Turquoise. And today I'm joined by Simon Dove, Head of Liquidity at Instinet, to talk about, liquidity. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you, Rugi. Lovely to be here, and thank you for having me.
Well, this episode is as much about you as it is about trading.
My favourite subject.
So let's dive right in. Let's start with you, your career, how you started in the industry, how your journey progressed, and what do you do today?
Good question. So from my side, in fact, my journey and my career started right here where we are today. So the London Stock Exchange back in 2001. Wasn't actually here at the time, it was down at Old Broad Street. I joined, actually by luck more than judgment. I saw an advert in the FT for a role, applied, come from a background where none of my family really had sort of operated or worked in capital markets. So I just fancied and the brand appealed to me, and I was lucky enough to be called in for an interview. Didn't get that job, but what I did get was another team that they were setting up, which was a support role, which really was on the client side. So the journey kind of commenced from there on in. Worked with some fabulous people over the time, spent sort of 10 years at the London Stock Exchange, different roles and responsibilities, kind of changing every 18 months. So mainly client sales focused, selling technology, selling obviously trading, account management around the top tier brokers, as well as running things like the LSE's market making working group. Really gave me great exposure, gave me a fantastic Rolodeck. The brand itself and having the London Stock Exchange business card gave me access to people really that I wouldn't have got access to until further down the career line. So fabulous sort of foundation, and it was a fabulous place to work, particularly to learn, the full front to back life cycle of trading. I then moved from the LSE onto a prop and market making firm, again in a semi-sales role, more business development, relatively small office in London, but actually that business was quite unique where it was offering and providing liquidity into broker crossing networks or banks. That was their global edge, and they were building the business in Europe, and I was lucky enough to join those guys. So it was really interesting to kind of be part of what was really a reverse sales cycle where we as a market maker were actually getting access to broker and bank liquidity, and building a liquidity provision around that strategy. And 4 or 5 fantastic years again with a great team. We scaled that. It was incredibly successful in terms of what it did, and we were one of sort of 2 or 3 firms that really kind of dominated that space. During that time, I was lucky enough to progress through the team there, and I was actually running the business in Europe, and I had regulatory responsibility quite early in my career, really, as a sort of CF1 and a CF3. One of those learning curves where probably it was a little earlier than it should have been in terms of my management experience, if I'm frank. I always remember one of these scenarios where at the time the FCA was taking a much closer look at the HFT space, and they were doing a thematic review on the HFT. And I came back from a holiday with the family in Euro Disney for the day, just to attend this meeting, and it was a fantastic learning curve to kind of take my business experience and my awareness of the regulatory environment and then apply it to kind of this kind of conversation. Great environment. I then moved away from that role to another prop market making firm. The world was evolving. MiFID II was on the horizon. Systematic internalizers were becoming part of the workflow. So before we were providing liquidity into banks, with MiFID II, those broker crossing networks weren't permitted, so it was a reversal of the relationships where we were creating the venues, we were buying the technology, wrapping the regulatory wrapper around that, and then going into banks and selling that product to the banks, going into the large tier ones who were looking for liquidity and actually justifying why we were better than our peers that were sort of progressing in that same way. Really great learning curve. Again, fabulous team I work with there. Good sort of strategies, liquidity, technology. I then moved away from the prop market making space into the sell side about 4 or 5 years ago, where I joined Instinet. Instinet, a technology-led broker, the original fintech, and really what I tried to complete with that circle was prop market making experience, some great exchange experience, then let's add some sell side experience, extend my network, and also extend my learning, challenge myself in a different environment. And it was a huge challenge. Learning about even the language that's used with clients around algo was very different to the conversation I was used to having with my previous kind of clients, which were the big tier one banks and those players. So it's been quite an interesting journey. I kind of look back and you have that moment of, actually this has been quite amazing. Part of it was hard work, part of it was luck, but nonetheless, as I sit here today, very proud and very pleased with that journey.
Yeah, I agree that it's usually a combination of hard work and luck most of the time, but you have to put that work in to be at the right place, right time, and overperform so the luck finds you.
Yeah.
It never comes and knocks on the door, does it? When I think about your journey, you started at the exchange, now you're exchange's client, right? So it's the other side of the table now. You're head of liquidity at Instinet. But if we take a step back for a second and think about liquidity, what do we mean? Let's cover the basics first. What do we mean by liquidity, especially in equity markets?
Yeah. It's a great question. It does mean different things to lots of different people broadly. Liquidity defines, I guess, workflow, defines opportunity, defines purpose in a way that, intent in terms of what people want to achieve. But broadly, liquidity in very simplistic fashion is supply and demand. How quickly can I get in and out of a position? How liquid is that stock? How illiquid is that stock? What is the liquidity going to do with the spreads that are available to that stock? And what is that going to have, the kind of impact that's going to have on what I'm trying to achieve from a trading perspective. Mid cap, small cap, illiquid stocks, hard to find stuff. We're very well serviced to a certain extent with very liquid names, which means very quickly if I wanted to buy a large stake in a business or a block or exercise or exit a position, I can do that very quickly. When it becomes more liquid, you need to be using different platforms, different techniques, different brokers, the skill set that originates. And, one of the things that I enjoyed about entering the Instinet business was really to see the diverse nature and the trust that came from our clients, whether it's the high touch workflow, the low touch workflow, the PT guys, the guys in London that look after the clients that are trading from Asia into London and vice versa, US into London. It's really quite fascinating to understand and get into the weeds. And the professionalism and the knowledge of those guys comes with experience. And that's why often, when we're talking about careers and progression, and next gen is a fabulous way, I think, to support the next generation of what I do today. You've got to realise that part of that journey is taking your time. I often talk to people about if you're ambitious too soon, that role I talked about earlier, where probably I was promoted into a role which actually from a experience and a management maturity I wasn't right for at that time. That takes in a level of awareness, and at the time I didn't see it, but now when I look back, again, part of the learning curve. So I hope I've kind of addressed some of that liquidity piece anyway.
You did, but also from the conversation we had so far, you've also mentioned a few bits like BCNs, MiFID, and then obviously after the MiFID II change, entered SIs into the room, BCNs are out. So I think it's worth highlighting also now, during your career, obviously you've witnessed the liquidity landscape in Europe change a lot. Maybe we should dive a bit deeper into evolution of liquidity from European market structure perspective.
Yeah, it's a good question, and weirdly links quite nicely. I seem to have correlated my career in line with the industry changing, which I think is a positive for me. From my perspective, we look back to the big bang in '86 where electronification and electronic markets came to the table. From my own personal experience, I joined the LSE at the point where it's demutualising. That was quite a significant change for the exchange because many of the members who owned it were taking seats and financial interest in the business, but were probably exiting quite quickly, which meant that they kind of lost control or influence on the business, which I think has played out in the last 25 years around competition and evolution. So where did we go after that? And I guess the obvious one to pull to is MiFID I, which really sort of introduced the concept of competition. And I remember being at the LSE when, the first competition that really came to the table for the LSE was an initiative called Market Boat, and Market Boat was really about trade reporting. And overnight, the LSE had to go from potentially charging like £3.60 for a trade report to 2p. This was the impact of competition and the positive impact. And the world evolved in that way. Competition then came about more evidently, competition and MTFs, the concept came around, really, post that MiFID I process. We then saw a journey into MiFID II, which again didn't happen till January, till 2018. It was January 2018. And I think from my perspective, we went through this concept of competition. We talked about Market Boat, we talked about MTFs, Chi-X, BATs, these guys that brought competition and pressure on exchanges who probably need a little bit of competition to suppress or at least control some of those fee intentions, should we say. We then had this concept where we had MiFID II, which really introduced another sort of change in the landscape where things like historically banks were internalising quite a lot of their flow, whether it be performance related, cost saving. We had the concept where BCNs were banned. And that then naturally leads the industry to innovate. The innovation really around that was the systematic internaliser, which was a regime that existed since MiFID I and hadn't necessarily been deployed. So, where did that impact? You sort of saw banks looking at using internalisers more directly. And we saw, and I mentioned it earlier, part of my journey at Tower Research was kind of helping to build their SI. So we saw 4 or 5 market makers, liquidity providers, ELPs as we like to call them today, introduce these concepts of SIs where they're streaming quotes and they're being executed against liquidity from banks. And from my perspective, it was the first time where prop firms sort of stood up and were a little bit more transparent. When I joined the prop market making space back in 2010, I went to the US and I was clearly briefed by my management in the US that I wasn't even allowed to tell my wife what I did. And no joke, that was the seriousness of how sensitive they were around information leakage. To this day, she still doesn't know what I do, to be frank. But anyway, different conversation. So if you think about how, and I remember being on panels with some of my peers from Citadel, XTX, Jane Street, HRT, and we were just really liberalising liquidity, market making, and breaking down this myth that people didn't need to be concerned. This liquidity is positive. It's really interesting, more so these days now with bilateral liquidity, because if you think about in 2018 when SIs came about, there was 1 or 2 SIs that wanted brokers to tag liquidity. They wanted to be able to segment. They wanted a bit more transparency on the end client. Client was very, very unhappy with that and was very clear that that wasn't permitted. The market maker would suggest it was a good thing because they could provide better liquidity. But actually the industry is fairly clear. We've evolved quite extensively since then. If you look at some of the noise now around bilateral liquidity, MTFs have evolved. We've gone through this kind of transition where dark liquidity and dark venues have become a staple part of liquidity ecosystem for us. And exchanges and MTFs and brokers themselves, including us, run their own dark pool to really provide quality liquidity. Periodic auctions became much more evident post MiFID II, predominantly as a reaction again to some of the restrictions and suppression of dark volume caps in MiFID II. So what I'm kind of proud of as an industry is that through the time we've evolved, and guess what, the biggest takeaway for all of us, and it's a message to those that who don't engage or welcome competition, is that broadly the pie has grown. You increase access, you increase transparency, you increase innovation, it increases the amount of liquidity and the opportunity, and it gives our clients more choice. And ultimately, everything we do has to be to their requirements and what they demand of us.
So when talking about the evolution, you took a very positive approach. You called it adding competition to the market. But if we now were to analyze or look at the status quo of liquidity in Europe, quite often we hear the phrase fragmented liquidity, especially in Europe, and it has this negative connotation to it. So if you were to describe the current state and maybe where the market is, you think, going into the future, what's the future of liquidity in Europe?
Got it.
Just curious to understand.
Completely.
If you're going to still take that positive angle.
No, I will take a positive, and I was going to address specifically to your comment around, perhaps people's interpretation and negative of fragmentation. What I would always say is that everyone who serves or provides an opinion will often be motivated by their own business agenda and their need. So they're not going to be balanced, you know. So actually those that don't like fragmentation are likely not to be benefactors or build a business that engages or enhances their client experience with it. Fragmentation is really where we've gone beyond just sort of one or two elements of competition. We've gone for a pan-European MTFs, you know, who are putting pressure onto primary exchanges for execution fees, and more lately around market data and port fees. Fragmentation, you could say, around mechanisms where, you know, the use of RFQs or bilateral liquidity is applying pressure to what really was the incumbent sort of lit books. So I think it depends how you do it. And, you know, as a firm that really our edge is curating and joining those dots. It's all about being agile, innovative enough to sort of draw that back together again and give the client the best possible experience. Very difficult for me to suggest competition is a bad thing. Transparency is the most important thing, actually. So yeah, competition, innovation, transparency, certainty. You know, we've got, you know, very clear regulatory structures in Europe that allow us to do certain things and allow us not to stop us from doing other things for a very good reason.
And it's probably with the regulatory changes coming this year. At the conference recently, 2026 was called the action year as well. So, but I'm glad you have very positive approach to it.
Absolutely.
Because, and it's good to hear the change of tone, I think, in the industry as well, where seems like there's added transparency, meaningful transparency, and the change is being taken very well by the market.
I think we started, you know, the conference you're referring to there, you know, we started that conference with a regulatory panel that talked about innovation, talked about speed of change, talked about needs for transparency. All the things that market practitioners, in my mind, and I'm far from the most expert in that space, welcome, because that kind of is where we've been trying to push in that journey as well.
Great. I think we've covered a lot of liquidity topic. It is from the start, the basics, the evolution, what is it today and where you think it's going. To finish off this episode, as usual, I'm going to ask you to share one piece of advice to your younger self or the next gen watching us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. A younger me. Now, one piece of advice is tough. Can I have a couple?
Of course, go ahead.
I think from my perspective, self-awareness is super important. Self-awareness of skill set, self-awareness of your presence, you know, understanding your skills so that you can deploy them appropriately. It also allows you to understand where your weaknesses are. And that's really very powerful because it allows you, again, to focus your own kind of journey and learning. You know, I look at meetings that I attend and the conversations I have today, and I remember 20 years being sent into meetings where I was sent in as the smiley guy to sit in the corner, you know, and that was broadly because I lacked depth in what I was bringing to the table. Again, self-awareness and understanding. And some of the really obvious things as well, from my own sort of perspective, this is a tough industry. This is an industry that we should be incredibly proud of. We also work hard to be here. You know, don't ever stop appreciating the environment, you know, the fact we've even sat in this beautiful room with this beautiful backdrop, and the things that we do on a daily basis. Very, very privileged. So, you know, be humble, be kind, you know, help others. You know, that moment of support. And to be frank, you know, I talked earlier around luck and whatever else. Much of the reason why I'm here today was the people that surrounded me. And that is corny in terms of the people around you make you, but it's absolutely true.
Yeah, I agree. Being humble when you're running a desk, I think that adds so much personality and makes senior guys in the industry a lot more approachable by the next gen.
Challenge, but also don't expect too much too soon. As in, you know, control that sort of development. Again, I go back to the point earlier, you know, making sure you're progressing at a pace. It will come. Experience is part of the journey. So yeah, challenge and demand, but demand reasonably. And that is about the self-awareness to understand the value. Have some great conversations with people. Have a mentor. One of my weaknesses probably over the years was never really having a mentor to guide me through that journey. And weirdly enough, I'm a terrible mentor today, to be honest. But I think at least sort of socialising, keep talking, I think all of the elements we've talked about, if we think about how we kind of improve ourselves, and actually, by the way, I've worked heavily around electronic markets with people that are hugely automated and smart. And it comes back to the same sort of scenario, be good to people, because often on the way up, they're the same people you meet on your way down, which again is corny but true.
Thank you. On the mentorship point, actually, I'm going to insert Fix Next Gen ad here. We do run mentorship schemes, so for those of you who want to link up with those who put themselves forward, including Simon, I know you're in our mentorship scheme now, helping young.
Perhaps choose those that are better at it than I am, but yeah, I take your point.
Please do join. Reach out to us. Happy to connect you and have that guidance that probably what Simon is saying has been missing as he was growing.
And actually, Rugi, I will back. Some of the people and the guys I work with are involved in Fix Next Gen. I've seen their network, their experience, their perspective, and their ability to grow being part of that. Incredibly powerful and incredibly useful. And these are the things, again, in the same way about seeking out development and education, seeking out places and things like Next Gen and people in it are really helpful for that future career.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I had a great conversation on liquidity, also hearing about you and your career path, and thank you for the advice. And thank you everyone for watching. See you at the next one.